Before I get stuck into my presentation, I just want to take you back to when I first started working for Nuffield Health. I started off as an academy health and wellbeing physiologist. Now, those of you that haven't had a health assessment, a physiologist is supposed to be a lifestyle expert that helps to prevent the onset of health-related diseases. So primordial prevention, preventing the onset of the risk factors in the first place. So to become a physiologist, you have to go through a full recruitment day. And one of the tasks on that recruitment day, where you're competing against other recruits, is to be given a set of statistics. So this is where my kind of relationship with using data to drive well-being strategy and outcomes kind of began. So I was given this set of data. We had all sorts of ages and genders. We also had health data, such as their smoking status, their exercise patterns, how good their sleep was, their stress management. And we were given the task of putting together an innovative intervention for preventing the onset of disease. Okay, so preventing the onset of disease. That was the scope. So when we had this discussion in the group where we were actually competing against each other, kind of like The Apprentice, I put forward the suggestion that we should pick a particular age group and a particular lifestyle factor and put together an intervention to focus on that specifically. I think that will bring us the best return. And of course, everybody completely disagreed with me. So rather than bring out the Welsh fiery debating side of myself, I decided to take it to a vote. So we said, okay, well, why don't we have a look at what the room thinks? Do we want to go with a specific intervention, or do we want to have an intervention that suits all? And of course, everybody voted against me. So we had to put together an intervention that was for all ages and for all lifestyle factors. So we're in this room being assessed by people around us who are the recruiters. And we then have to deliver a presentation to that same set of people on what our intervention is. And of course, we delivered the presentation. Straight after the presentation was the questions. And the first question was, I've noticed that you haven't used a specific age group and a specific lifestyle factor for your intervention. So obviously we're all looking at each other and we're thinking, they know we discussed that, so this is a bit awkward. But instead of going against the grain, I acted as a team player and I said, well, we discussed it as a group and collectively decided that we don't want to leave anybody out of the intervention. But obviously I was the one that got the job. So clearly my thought process was the right thought process. So that really, I wanted to tell that story because a lot of what I discussed in this presentation links back to that concept of using data in the right way. So let's get started. Now, contrary to James's valid point that every good presentation starts with a big number, I've decided to go against the grain, as usual, and start with some big logos instead. But there are plenty of numbers in my presentation as well. So if we're considering employee outcomes and we have an interest in making employees like being at work and having less stress, having less mental health issues, and understanding what they could do to improve those factors and reduce their risk of disease, what I want to do is actually have a look at some companies that are known for being great places to work. And through my research of looking at these individual companies, I wanted to highlight some of my favourite things of perks at work that they provide. And if you've looked into this yourself, you will have seen some of these already. So let's start with Facebook. And they have gourmet chefs on campus providing free food all day, every day while you're at work. Brilliant. They also have a music room where you can go to, during your shift to just go and boost your creative juices. And of course, you can't be penalised for being on Facebook at work. Then you have smaller companies like Innocent. They have an office in London where they have a baby wall, which is everybody that's based in the office has a picture of them as a baby up on the wall to show that we all start in the same place, or start in the same way at least. And they don't have kind of departments to sit with each other. They have people from finance and marketing all actually sitting together. So they sit wherever they want to sit to kind of foster this culture of bringing home to work rather than feeling like at work. So I quite like that concept. But Google has to be my favourite. It does all the things that Facebook does, but you can also get your hair cut for free. You can get your car washed, and you can get your oil changed in your car, which I think is brilliant. But the one that really stood out for me was that at Google, in their head office, you can actually have they provide private cabins that can be used to spend time with a loved one for quality time. What that entails, I don't know, and I'm sure they don't report that in their MI data. But just the fact that they're thinking more about, what actually helps the employees to feel good about being at work, I think that's really pushing the boundaries. So now that we understand, you've got these kind of cool perks at work that probably make people feel happier and want to be at work more. There probably is, less of an established metric for proving that that's effective. But we've got to start there. We've got to start with what works well before we can start to consider how we can use data to our advantage. But now looking more specifically at the initiatives that are available to employees, if you look at Britain's Healthiest Workplace, they put together data to have a look at what initiatives are available. And on average, they found that all the companies that they have as part of their programme have, on average, 30 initiatives available, of which employees are aware of 10. And of those 10, generally speaking, people are involved or engaging with 3 of those 10. So when we come back to that story that I started off with, about having lots of data and putting together an intervention to suit all, maybe we should start thinking about putting together targeted interventions that focus on the area of interest or the area that's having the biggest impact. And, it's no mistake that we will be talking about mental health in some guys in this presentation, and also MSK issues. I'm sure, that won't be a surprise to everybody. But I thought this was particularly interesting that this highlights the very story that I started with. And now we've started to think more about data and using data to our advantage. Being the physiologist that I am and the scientist, at heart, I like to research things and question why and how. So I wanted to go back to have a look at where did data measurement start. So before I move on to the next slide, just by a show of hands, how many of you are aware of how we used to measure distance before the ruler was invented? Right, okay, I'm going to blow some minds. So it was the king's hand or the king's foot, which was problematic when the king changed and a new king came into reign. So if we use this king as an example, it wasn't this king that it started with. I think it's just a recognisable king for us to use as a reference point. But we're talking 3000 BC. We're talking ancient Egypt. And they used to actually use something called a cubit, which is a measurement of the arm, the hand, and the hand on top of that. And they created a royal cubit, which was the king or the pharaoh at the time, which was then mass-produced into a granite ruler. So that was a granite cubit. And then that was when construction in Egypt flourished. So a standard measure of distance then allowed more consistent construction. And then it wasn't until in the 18th century in France that le metre was put forward. So the metre that we use, in common day measurement, is actually a measure of, it's 1/10,000,000th of the distance between the North Pole and the equator. Okay, so there's a bit of pub quiz trivia for you there. That was calculated using trigonometry, and then it's been advanced more recently, but we're not going to get too much into the depth. What I want to just highlight was that we used to have a point where there was no standard measurement. We now have got to the point where there's so much data being collected, actually we don't know how to manage that data. And it's theorised that 90% of all of the health data that we have available today was actually created was captured in the last 2 years. And that's thanks to, there was a few apps that were, referred to in James' presentation. There's a few more apps on here as well that are responsible for collecting data. We have mobile phones, tablets, smartwatches, and they're collecting this data, but we don't necessarily know what to do with that data. And we're at risk of letting the data shape what our interventions are. If we were to collect all of the data, say, for example, on fitness, and we looked at how fit people were, and we targeted the least fit population, and we put together an intervention that was on increasing intensity to then improve performance, which ultimately does improve fitness, and we deliver that intervention, you should expect there to be an improvement in fitness. Sure. But what if the reason for the low fitness was because they were overtraining and they were fatigued? And then we put together an intervention to increase their intensity for someone that's already overtrained. So we're at this point where we've got so much data available to us. That's a gift. We just need to figure out how to use that data. And we need to understand what it is we're trying to achieve before we even assess the data. Now, this is a risky move based on the population of the audience. But by a show of hands, do either yourself or your company capture and record absence data? By a show of hands. Okay, now keep your hands up if you think that is good quality or accurate data. Okay, couple one down. And keep your hands up if you use that data to inform your wellbeing strategy. So there's still some. That's fantastic. There's still some hands up. That's brilliant. Unfortunately, it's the minority in the room. So we're in a position where even though we are collecting data, we might not actually be using the data that's available to us. So when we questioned some of the companies that use our health services, we approached companies that have more than 1,000 people, employees, to find out, do they track absenteeism and do they use that data? So the same types of questions. And we found that actually 30% have no absence recording process in place at all. So they're not even recording the data. Now, yes, absence data is one of the forms you can use to assess where you should be focusing or targeting your interventions. If it's accurate data, we'll come on to that point a bit later on. But there are other forums as well. You have occupational health data, you have EAP data, and obviously you have health assessment data, and that's where the physiologists come in. So it's not all down to whether or not you track absence data. It's more about whatever data you're collecting, how are you using that data. And interestingly, I've made this point already, you need to understand what it is you're trying to achieve before you start to think about what your intervention is going to be focused on. Often it is on reducing spend on illness. Makes a lot of sense. Sometimes it is genuinely to improve well-being. I'm sure that Google didn't put the cabins in place to improve spend on illness. They put that in place to enhance well-being. So it doesn't really matter what the end goal is or what the end outcome is, but it does need to be considered before you start to shape your interventions. We're talking higher level now, whether it's financial or whether it's well-being or if it's a combination of the two. But you can take that very same concept of what are you hoping to achieve with the very small data sets. So even just taking absence data, for example, what are you actually hoping to achieve with collecting that absence data? One of the companies that we have worked with, one of our health assessment clients, who is a utilities company, they wanted to reduce their spend on absence, or MSK specifically, because they were finding that there was a lot of absence in their engineers due to MSK issues. So we wanted to find out a bit more about that. So what is the actual rationale behind this? Why are they looking to put together this intervention? And we found that ultimately the goal was financial, to reduce the spend on MSK issues. But then we also found that they actually had more of an issue in mental health in their contact centres. So rather than just providing physiotherapy to all staff, we put together suggestions of how to go about structuring their strategy. One of the suggestions we made was to actually have a cognitive behavioural therapist at one of the key contact centres that had the biggest issue with mental health, and then only to provide physiotherapy to the engineers. And therefore, the end goal of what they wanted to achieve was achieved, but through a more targeted means. I'm still talking high level here, so there's a lot of granular detail involved in that, and operationalising something like that is not straightforward, and that's a bit more bespoke in terms of what we tend to do as a company. But that's a good example of how, rather than just thinking of the end goal and designing a strategy just for that end goal, it's about putting context in and making it more meaningful. So, of course, MSK, musculoskeletal issues. Commonly thought of as just being back pain, but actually it's anything to do with the musculoskeletal structure in the human body that might cause pain. And this is usually either the number one or the number two, or it's always within the top 5 reasons for absenteeism or presenteeism when you look at CIPD data. So, of course, this has to be in conversations when talking about putting together interventions to improve employee outcomes. And, of course, there are multiple ways of approaching this as an issue. And this is, if you didn't have that absence data or you didn't have any way of establishing what should be the focus points of your company, you can use things like MSK and mental health as 2 generic approaches. Not the recommendation, but there's always a way. And if we're talking about statistics and costs, estimated that 31 million days a year are lost due to MSK problems alone. Now, as another example of where we've suggested an intervention to result in an improved employee outcome, we had another corporate client of ours, car manufacturer, and we identified that in one of their specific locations, one of their factories, there was a particular issue with ankle and foot problems, and that was, of course, resulting in a lot of absenteeism. Now, of course, in a car manufacturing factory, if you have one person off the conveyor belt of the manufacturing line, that's going to have an impact for sure. So we actually had one of our head physiotherapists attend that location to find out are there particular movement patterns that might be resulting in this type of particular issue. And they found that when hanging on doors, there was a hammering needed in order to mount the door onto the car. I know it sounds a bit archaic in this day and age, but that is still, there is very much a manual element of car manufacturing. And they found that particular movement is likely to be causing strain on the ankle and on the feet. So the suggestion, the suggestion that was taken up was to actually provide better footwear that had more ankle support, and to train actually hammering from the other angle as well as their preferred angle in order to reduce the strain on the ankle and the feet. And the end outcome was, of course, that they reduced their spend on MSK issues because they helped to go to the root cause. So again, looking at an overall issue, MSK, targeting it down to the problem area, so to speak, and putting an intervention that suited that particular site, ended up in what they were hoping to achieve. It was successful. Of course, mental health had to be included in this presentation at some point. Thankfully, I don't need to define mental health. Two fantastic presenters have already done that for me. But one thing I will bridge the gap between is MSK and mental health being extrinsically linked. So I've had this discussion with many a specialist about what comes first. Is there one that comes first, or do they both come at the same time? What's more predominant than the other? I've got my opinions on it, but that's not for today, or maybe for the question time, we'll see. But the system in our body that is involved in feeling pain and sensing pain is part of the same system that is responsible for giving us a stress response, our fight or flight reaction. So when we're in pain, we are essentially experiencing a stress response. So when someone does have an MSK issue, what we found is that 30% of the MSK sufferers inherently also have an issue with their mental health. And this was the stat that was referred to in Bev's presentation. Thriving at work, obviously the report there. The overall cost, estimated to be between £1,200 and £1,500 per employee. So that's not per ill or affected employee, that's per employee. And that's per year. That's a significant cost for something that potentially does have remedies that are focused on lifestyle and other areas that could improve or actually reduce the risk of mental health in the workplace, mental health issues in the workplace. We, of course, all have a mental health. Coming on to those lifestyle factors in particular, being a physiologist, lifestyle factors are always at the forefront of my thought process. I don't believe that they're the only way, but I certainly believe that they are an effective remedy for things like MSK issues or mental health issues. And when we collect all of our data for our health assessment clients, we tend to report that data back, depending on how engaged the client is. Could be monthly, could be quarterly, could be annually. But what we found across the whole of the Nuffield Health estate for all clients is that the three key stats that always come up relate to alcohol consumption and physical activity, both of which can influence MSK issues and mental health issues. So estimated that 4 in 10 are consuming more alcohol than is recommended, which is the 14 unit per week recommendation. Although a recent report has suggested that no alcohol is good alcohol. Certainly not going to be recommending that today. But the other two really important, I think, bits of data from our whole Nuffield Health estate is that of physical activity. So only 9.2% of individuals are satisfying the 150 minutes per week recommendation to just maintain health or good health. And interestingly, just before I came into this room, I read the report that's on your chairs. And if you haven't yet read it, when you read it, you'll see that sedentary behaviour by itself is another risk factor for all-cause mortality. So if we take something like physical activity, as an example, if there was a way that we could change the culture of the workforce in order to be more active as part of the daily routine, that would in itself have a massive impact on both MSK and mental health issues. But researchers actually found that taking someone that doesn't track their steps to just tracking their steps sees a reduction in absence by about 30%. And that's just from tracking the steps, becoming more aware of that data collection. And if you combine that with some kind of coaching of some kind, it's found that there's a 65% reduction in red and amber flags for health risks. So collecting the data and then using the data to inform lifestyle change discussions seems to be the most effective way to reduce the impact from mental health and MSK issues in the workplace. Not the only way, but a very effective way. So really then, in summary, what we need to consider when putting together some form of wellbeing strategy in order to improve employee outcomes, first of all, we need to understand what it is that we actually want to achieve before we start collecting the data. Once we've understood what it is we want to achieve, and then we understand what data we can collect, we need to understand which data specifically we want to use in order to evidence our improved outcome at the end of it. Ideally, it shouldn't be the data driving the strategy. It should be the strategy being driven, or not being driven by, but being informed by the data that you're collecting, ultimately resulting in a more meaningful intervention. Now, I think that the future of health assessment delivery and wellbeing in the workplace centres around preventative or predictive analytics. We're using clinically validated algorithms to understand what is the risk within the workforce, and for the individual to understand what their risk is before attending their health assessment, so they can pick a tailor-made health assessment in order to focus on their areas of either risk or interest. I think that will result in much more beneficial outcomes from health assessment delivery, And if all else fails, then I think we should just all invest in some of those private cabins that Google have.